and again, I appreciate that verse you brought up. What was that? 2 Timothy this morning, right? I didn't write it down because I wasn't planning on talking about it until you mentioned it. So was it 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7? For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of sound mind. And I would say that very first part, God hath not given us the spirit of fear. That really kind of speaks to what's been going on to us today, this past 6 months, because of the COVID thing. We live in fear, and it's been frustrating to not be able to go to Best Buy and buy a computer when your laptop is broken, to not be able to, go to a restaurant to sit down with your family because you got 5 kids and occasionally you like to get out of the house, or to go to Chick-fil-A and just let them play on the playground for 5 minutes. It's been a little bit frustrating. And I'll say this much, it's been very isolating. I don't know about you guys, but for me, my work has been a little bit chaotic. Right now, I got to come in the door. I got to wear my mask as I come in the door. I have to go into my office, close my door, take my mask off, and I have to work with my door shut. I'm not allowed to talk to anybody. I'm not supposed to be doing anything. I'm not even really supposed to go across the street into the refinery to go talk to the operators, the people who I've worked with for the past 5 years, because I might get them sick. And if they get sick, the whole refinery could shut down. So my job is to stay on my side of the street and try to keep everybody safe. And it's just been extremely frustrating. And I know I'm not the only one, but there's always a little bit of a silver lining. For my family, it's also been a little bit of a blessing in disguise. I know up until recently, we had these sermons that Pastor Don would write up and email out. Those were a blessing because it gave you a chance to sit there and read through the sermon. And if you missed something, you could always just go back up and reread it. If you didn't have a chance to read it on Sunday morning, you could read it on Sunday night or Tuesday night if that's what you felt like, if that's when you were able to get to it. And that was a little bit of a blessing. And for me, it was a blessing because I got to be a little bit of a delivery man to several families here, to Brother Robert and his family, to Miss Wanda, to Miss Nina, to Miss Connie for a little bit there, to Miss Dottie, who, it's her birthday, so she chose not to come here tonight to be with me, to Brother Tim. And it was a very interesting blessing, because what my Google Maps said would take about 30 minutes just going house to house to house to drop off usually took somewhere in the neighborhood about 3 to 4 hours. Because I'd stop to talk to Brother Tim, and we'd be out in his front yard for about 30, 40 minutes. I go stop, talk to Brother Robert. Next thing you know, we're sitting in his garage, and it's 2 hours later, and my wife's going, "Why aren't you home yet?" It's like, well, I'm only halfway through my deliveries. These were some of the blessings. For my family, we've also been able to participate in some of these sermons online. My kids were able to go to Sunday school with Lighthouse Baptist Church down out of Moreno Valley. Some friends that we met there at youth camp. We were also able to do children's church with Bible Baptist Temple out in Georgia. We had our music that we would do on a Sunday would be with the Gettys, Keith and Kristen Getty. They were doing a hymn sing with their family, and they would do it on Tuesdays. We'd save it for Sunday, and so we'd have a half hour of listening to gospel music with an Irish family who's currently in Nashville, Tennessee. And then we would have, on top of the sermon that Pastor Don would give us, we'd also attend a morning service with the church that I met my wife in, under that pastor, Abundant Life Church, out in Kansas City, Missouri. So I was able to be able to be a part of worshiping God across our country because of COVID right now. I never would have done this otherwise. And that experience brings to mind a story. It's one of my favorite stories. It's one I've told my kids. It's one I've told the youth group. So Andrea, you heard it just last week, so you're going to have to put up with it again. But it's a story about 5 blind men. It's a tale out of India. 5 blind men, blind since birth, are led to an elephant. And they are told to describe what they find. They're supposed to describe the elephant as best they can. You got the first blind man who comes up, and he reaches up, and he says, an elephant is like a thin rope. Interesting. You got another man who comes up and he feels the elephant and he describes the first thing he finds. He says, an elephant is like a tree stump. You get a third man who comes up and he feels the elephant. He describes like what he finds. He says, an elephant is like a brick wall. You get the fourth man who comes up. He feels the elephant, describes what he finds. And he says, an elephant is like a big fan. And then the last man comes up. He feels the elephant. And he reaches out, comes to the front of the elephant. He says, an elephant is like a thick snake. Now, as I've asked my kids multiple times, which man was wrong? What's the correct answer, kiddos? It's a trick question. All of them are wrong, and none of them are wrong. They're all describing what they have found, what they can recognize out of this elephant. And just like those blind men, when we come to just talk about God, each one of us is blind. We can't get the whole picture of God. So each one of us comes forward, we grab what we can, and we try to describe the little that we can understand about God. And each one of us as individuals, we're going to struggle. But each of those blind men, if you put all of their descriptions together, you get a better picture of what that elephant is. If we come together and discuss God and talk about God, get a little bit of a perspective from a church out in Missouri, or a church down in Moreno, or from an Irish family in Nashville, Tennessee. I still think that's funny. I'm sorry. We get a little bit more of the picture of who and what God is. I want you to open your Bibles this morning. We're going to open our Bibles to Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2. And you're welcome to put your finger there. I'm not going to come back to it, but you're welcome to put your finger there because it's a good verse. Luke chapter 2. And going to verse 46. And it came to pass that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions. And all that heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. This one's interesting because we're talking about Jesus. He's gone to the temple. He's about 12 years old at this point. He goes with his family, probably for his, is it the bar mitzvah or the bat mitzvah? I get those two confused. But it's pretty much his becoming a man ceremony as he goes to the temple to make the sacrifice. And when his family leave, they go about a day down the road, realize that he's not there, have to come back, and they search 3 days looking for him. When they finally find him, he's sitting there in the temple. This story, as it relates to what I was talking about just a minute ago, shows us a couple of things. One, there were people in the temple on a day that most likely wasn't the Sabbath day, talking about God. They'd come together to discuss God, to discuss his word. And there were doctors there, there were scholars there, there were most likely some of their priests there who were talking about God. And then into their midst comes a 12-year-old boy. You know what that tells us? One, that this thing was open to the public, that people were welcome to come there and listen to them. Because why in the world would they let a 12-year-old boy, no matter how wise he was, why would they let him sit there and talk to the doctors, talk to the scholars? This was open to the public, and people were welcome to come and talk about God. And I think that's amazing. And here you have God, Jesus, who is God, who's walking here on this earth. And in many of his parables, many of his stories, as I've been going through with the teens, are there to teach us about who and what God is. So we're supposed to be getting a perspective of what God is from God himself, and he's explaining it to us. And yet still we can't quite get the picture of who and what God is, which doesn't seem to make sense because it's God, it's Jesus. He should be able to explain anything. But let me ask you this. How do you explain color to a blind man right now? A man who has never seen the color blue in his life. How do you explain that to him? You might try giving some examples, like, I don't know, blue. It's a cool color. It's like clean running water over your hands. You could describe blue as. Maybe green, you want to go with, it's the smell of springtime right after refreshing rain. It's the feel of grass underneath your bare feet. Red, it's hot, it's fire, it's roasting meat is the color red. pink, maybe it's soft like a rose. And the more you describe, maybe the better your picture of these colors get. But that blind man, he's never going to be able to enjoy the sunset, the colors of the sun as it sets over the ocean. How do you describe that? So we struggle together to define who and what God is in our own lives. And the more we work together, the more we talk together, the better a picture, the better an understanding we will eventually get. Now, that's been my experience during this whole COVID thing, is trying to branch out. And the blessing has been in being able to talk about God to many people, maybe get a better, slightly better, because my understanding wasn't all that good to begin with, but at least a slightly better understanding of who and what God is. But there's been a whole bunch of challenges during this time because of COVID. I mentioned delivering these sermons. I would spend 3-4 hours every Sunday and every Thursday delivering these sermons. My day would start right around 9-10 o'clock. I'd come up here, print off the sermons, go make my deliveries, maybe make it home about 1-2 o'clock, eat lunch. Well, a normal Sunday, I go to church, and then about noon, I eat lunch, have some fun with the kids, then come back to church. Well, right now, my day, my church time hasn't even started yet. So it's very easy to say, I just spent all this time serving God. I don't need to sit here and learn about God now. At least that was what was going in my mind. And it took a couple of times for us not doing it to me to realize, no, you know what, we need to sit down, buckle down. Christy, just when I get home, have food ready, and then we'll turn it on. Don't even give me a second to say no. And that was serving God. I was still struggling with that. What about, I don't know, some of the struggles that you guys are going with? We got kids who aren't in school, which, blessing for the kids, right? Except now you got parents who are at home with these kids all the time. That's a bit of a hardship. You've got people struggling with their health. I mean, we are in the middle of a health crisis. People are sick and dying because of this. And I know personally people who have died during this time. My grandfather died not because of COVID, but because of other complications just a few weeks ago. We went to his funeral. I flew out to Dallas, flew back in about 3 days, went there to the funeral, and it was probably the strangest funeral I'd been to because he was a church-going man. I'm as confident as I can be that he was a Christian man just by his testimony. And I got a brief glimpse of what his life at his church was like, just from the men who stood up and talked about the relationship with him. But that was during the funeral. Then we had the internment, and then everybody left. There's no service afterwards. There's no getting to know these people who knew my grandfather. And this was out in Dallas. The next time I'm probably going to be out in Dallas? Probably not. My grandfather's not there anymore. So these are men and women that knew my grandfather that I could have had shared experiences with, and now I can't. My brother had an interesting time right here at the beginning of COVID because he's a nurse. For the very first 6 weeks, right after the health crisis was announced, to till about 6-8 weeks later, he had to self-isolate in his own home, which means he had a special room that they made up in his house. He came in the back door, he went upstairs, his wife would leave the food for him on the door, or in front of his door, and the only time he got to see his kids or his wife was either through a glass window or on his phone for about 8 weeks. And those are just small hardships when all's said and done, to what each and every one of us is going through right now. I'll tell you what, right now, it feels like the floodwaters are rising. The trials, the temptations, the sorrows, the pain, it's all coming crashing in. So that actually brings me to the actual lesson that I have for tonight. How is your foundation right now? Your spiritual foundation. Where's it at? How is it right now? If you're still in your Bible in Luke chapter 3, let's go ahead and flip a few pages over to Luke chapter 6, just a few chapters over. And we'll be in verse 47. Hopefully this is a very familiar passage for you guys. I mean, we all kind of learned this song when we were kids. It's a wonderful song, probably one of my favorites when I was a kid. But here in verse 47, whosoever cometh to me and heareth my sayings and doeth them, I will shew you to him, to whom he is like. He is like a man which built an house and digged deep and laid the foundations on a rock. And when the flood arose, the stream beat vehemently upon that house and could not shake it, for it was founded upon a rock. But he that heareth and doeth not is like a man that without a foundation built a house upon the earth, against which the stream did beat vehemently, and immediately it fell, and the ruin of the house was great. This is one we teach our kids. I'm assuming, Miss Nina, you've taught this one before. I know I taught this one a couple times when I was in Sunday school. It's a fun one because there's a fun song, and at the end of the song, you get to go splat. That's probably my favorite part as a kid. You guys want to sing it? No, all right, I won't make you guys stand up here and sing it with me. But it's a simple lesson. It's a lesson simple enough that we tend to teach our kids. And the ultimate lesson is build your house, or your foundation should be in the Lord. When you build your spiritual house, build it upon the Lord, and you'll stand firm. I mean, that's the ultimate message out of this. But it's when the floodwaters start coming up that we really, truly understand how firm that foundation we've built truly is. Because we can be deceived by how strong what might seem like a solid foundation, when those floodwaters rise, you find out that it wasn't built strong in the first place. And it might sound weird. I'm an engineer. I love building things. I love learning about building and whatnot. So I'm going to bring a little bit of that to my lesson tonight. Who here has ever been to Chicago? City of Chicago? You've been through Chicago. That's about all I've got. I flew into O'Hare, flew out. Everyone knows where Chicago is, though, more or less, right there on the Great Lakes. Some people say it's a beautiful city from a distance. But that's all I've done as I've passed through. But the city of Chicago is interesting. Because back in the 50s, 60s, well, when it was first built, back in about 1820, a couple hundred years ago, it was built on a swamp. And it was maybe only a foot above the water level. So the streets were packed dirt, and there was no place for the sewage to run off. Whenever the waters rose, it flooded out the streets. I mean, that's where the stoops come from, because they had to build a few levels up so that their front door wouldn't get, covered in mud and water. They could actually exit. And back in the 50s and 60s, they decided that they needed to put in a sewage system. So they came up with a plan to raise the city. I kid you not. They planned to lift the city. They got jacks underneath the foundations. Yes, they did. Look it up. It's pretty interesting. And they slowly jacked up these houses, pretty much all of downtown Chicago. They jacked it up. Buildings, banks, restaurants, homes, sometimes with people in it, and sometimes these people had no idea it was going on. They lifted up these houses, some 4 foot, some as high as 14 feet. They lifted these houses up. It was an absolutely engineering marvel. And you're going, why haven't I heard of this? It was back in the 50s, 60s. Some of you guys were there. That's because it wasn't the 1950s. This was the 1850s. Picture doing that in the 1850, 1860, finishing up around the time of the Civil War going on, lifting an entire city as high as 14 feet. Absolutely wonderful. But here's the thing, Chicago, even in spite of all this, over the past 100 years, it's already sunk down a little bit. It's sunk down about 4 inches right now. 4 inches what the geological surveys are saying, which doesn't seem like much until you get a concrete foundation and you realize 4 inches means your house is coming down. 4 inches is a huge amount. The city is sinking, and over the next 100 years, it might sink as much as another foot, which is just crazy to think about. This city of skyscrapers and pavement and sidewalks is sinking. Go to New Orleans. Anyone been to New Orleans? If you haven't been to Chicago, I don't know if you've been to New Orleans. I haven't been, but again, it's another interesting one. Again, another city built on a swamp. You'd think we really would have learned. But no, we built another city on a swamp. It's very unstable ground. You know those skyscrapers? I looked it up. There are skyscrapers in New Orleans. In order to build the foundations there, they have to put steel, pilings. I kept wanting to say they're piers, but steel pilings into the ground. So this is a steel rod, solid steel rod, sometimes 1 to 2 feet thick, that they are hammering into the ground up to about 100 feet down into the ground to create a solid base. So they're touching the bedrock, and then they can build their foundation on probably about 20 of these for one of those big skyscrapers. That's what's required to build that foundation, that solid building, that solid steel building that you think is firm requires that, because otherwise it would be sinking. It would fall. Taking it a little bit closer to home for us, Missouri. Pretty much everywhere we went in Missouri, they had basements. Everyone had basements. We were in Tornado Alley. Basements were kind of a necessary, which is very interesting because the water table was only about 2 to 3 feet deep. If you know anything about the water table, you build anything underneath that means that room is going to start to flood. If the water rises at all, it's going to start to flood. And the interesting part, this is one I didn't know until I was an engineer and started learning some of the structural civil design work. They actually have to design those basements so that they will not float. The issue isn't so much that it sinks, it's that the water level will rise, and the foundation, if you don't build it properly, the house will start to float and will rise up a foot or two. It's completely nuts. Again, what you thought was solid might start floating away on you. And even here in beautiful sunny California, where the ground is always stable, there's never any, bedrock shifting, none of this, earth, what are they called again? Earth shakes. None of that ever happens here in California, right? Here, my driveway, there's a spot in my driveway that's fallen about 6 inches. Just a small little corner of my driveway. And I can actually look underneath there where all the sand, the dirt, the ag base that was under there, it's washed out a good 2 or 3 inches even below what it's dropped out. It's a driveway. It's one that I would park my car on. My truck is currently parked on, but right now run the risk of my truck falling in about 2-3 inches. Not much, but that's kind of a big deal. What we assume is solid, what we assume will last forever, might not. All these places are in danger of their foundations come tumbling down and taking down the homes, the skyscrapers, these buildings with it. The same is true in our spiritual life. We might think our foundation is solid. We might we might assume that it's not going anywhere. But unless you maintain it, unless you take care of it, that foundation, you might find out that it's cracking. You might find out that it's washing away underneath. And that when those flood waters come up, your house is going with it. Your spiritual house might go with it. So what do? First thing we do, just like any foundation, it requires inspection work. It requires inspection to make sure that, it's still stable. In your spiritual life, maybe this means introspection instead. It requires prayer. Psalm 139, verse 23 and 24. I know Pastor Don's said this one a few times. I think it's a good one. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. And see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Are you asking God to search your heart? To try you, and to know your thoughts? Are you asking God to test your foundation in Him? Second thing it requires maintenance. Back there in Missouri, I know my mom bought about 3-4 cubic yards of dirt one summer and had me and my brother pretty much, I'd say we use a wheelbarrow, but we didn't have one. What we had were sleds. So my brother and I, we'd take shovels and we'd shovel it onto the sled and we'd drag it in summer in 95 to 100 degree heat, which doesn't sound bad to you guys until you realize that humidity there was about 90%. And you walk outside and you just start sweating. So here's my brother and I, we're hauling this dirt around and we're packing it around the foundation of the house, trying to create a slope so that water will start flowing away and won't just kind of stand up against the foundation and, cause our house to float away. Just like with our house in Missouri, it requires regular maintenance. Your spiritual life requires regular maintenance. You need to continue to pray. You need to continue to study the Word. And you need to continue to have these discussions with your fellow Christians to grow your spiritual life by discussing who and what God is. Discussing the sermons, even maybe the one tonight. Discuss it with your wife, with your friends. Are you sharing God? Not just with the non-believer, but with the believer. Are you sharing God? Final thing you might need to do is you might need to do some repair work. Just like a foundation that's cracked, that's, settling in a low spot, you might need to repair your foundation. This one you might not be able to do alone. This one you might need to reach out to a friend. You might need to reach out to your pastor or another godly man, an elder in the church, like Brother Don. I'm going to put him on the spot. You might need to reach out to them to help you repair that foundation that seems to be crumbling in your life. Just like in all things, we should be looking to the Bible for our examples for where our life should go. There's an example in the book of Joshua. Go ahead and turn with me to Joshua chapter 4. Of what it means to build a foundation. Joshua chapter 4. We're going to go ahead and start in verse 4. Then Joshua called the 12 men, whom he had prepared of the children of Israel, out of every tribe of man. And Joshua said unto them, Pass over before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of Jordan, and take you up every man of you a stone upon his shoulder, according unto the number of the tribes of the children of Israel, that this may be a sign among you, that when your children ask their fathers in the time to come, saying, What mean ye by these stones? Verse 7, Then ye shall answer them, that the waters of Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it passed over Jordan, the waters of Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be forever a memorial unto the children of Israel forever. Here you got, as Israel is leaving the desert, they're about to enter the promised land, the land that God promised Abraham, that was promised again to Isaac and to Jacob. The land that the people of Israel have been striving for about 400 plus years at this point. And they've been wandering in the desert for 40 years. Are now finally about to enter the promised land. And the very first thing that they do, the very first thing out of the very riverbed that they're crossing, as God stops the waters, just like he did at the Red Sea, as God stops the waters in the River Jordan, these 12 men are supposed to pick up a stone. Now, this isn't like my kids picking up a rock and say, Daddy, can you put this in your pocket? These men were having to put these stones on their shoulders. So these were some heavy stones that they pick up out of the middle of this riverbed. They carry over into the promised land, and there, the very first thing they do is they built an altar. They build the foundation for an altar right there out of these stones. And this foundation, these stones, this altar, was supposed to be a symbol of what God had done for the people of Israel. This was supposed to be a symbol of the foundation of where they were putting the foundation of their nation. It was supposed to be in God. And they were supposed to take this was supposed to be a memorial. They're supposed to tell their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren about what God had done for them. And this altar was supposed to be the symbol of that foundation. And as you continue reading, you get to the end of the book of Joshua, and everything kind of ends on a very hopeful note. You see the people who are declaring that they will be following God, that they will only follow God, that they will not seek elsewhere. And it seems like the foundation of Israel will stand firm. It will be solid. It will last an eternity. And then you turn the page to the book of Judges. And you start reading Judges chapter 1. And you start seeing little hints of cracks forming as the children of Israel neglect to follow through on what God has asked them to do. God has told them to do. They neglect to send out, or to chase the Canaanites out, and some of the other tribes that they were told by God, defeat them and drive them from this land. And yet they didn't. In chapter 2, verse 7, 8, and 9, I'll go ahead and read these. Verse 7, and the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord that he did for Israel. And Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. And they buried him in the border of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the mountain of Ephraim, on the north side of the hill, Gaash. Everything was good. The foundation was solid. They did right all the days of Joshua as he stood there and watched over them, as he maintained that foundation for the children of Israel. But then in verse 10, you see what happens when you start to neglect that foundation. And also all that generation were gathered unto their fathers, and there arose another generation after them, which knew not the Lord, nor yet the works which he had done for Israel. And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and served Balaam. What should have been a solid foundation was destroyed because the children of Israel forgot to maintain it. They forgot to keep it, to tell their children. They forgot. And because of that, their relationship with God was destroyed. Now, as Andrea comes up here, gets ready to play a little bit of music for us, we're going to have a little bit of an invitational. Go ahead and bow your heads. Let's close our eyes.